Alright, how are you guys doing? Welcome back to the channel. Before we start, for those who are here just to download free LUTs, they're down here in the description and they are 100% free. They are the conversion LUTs, which means you can convert your desaturated look from C-Log 1, 2, or 3 to Rec 709 and get a nice crispy look. These are official Canon LUTs and also one custom LUT that I made myself that really works great with Canon R5 and as well as Canon C70. Also, I teamed up with Subtle and we will be giving away 2 free rain jackets valued $100 each. So if you want to look cool like this, stay tuned. The details are further in this video. In this video, I would like to go over some important things about Canon C70. Like, who is this camera for? Where does it lay? Is this a cinema camera or this is almost like a hybrid little upgrade from the R5? Is it as good as C200 or is it as good as the red Komodo? Let's try to find out. So ever since Canon R5 came out, there's been a lot of controversial talks about it. But when cinema camera comes out like a C70, it kind of got missed out, I feel like. Not a lot of people put a lot of attention to it as it should get. But now in 2022, since the camera been around for about a year, more people started to notice it and getting interested in it. In a nutshell, it's a cinema camera with a Super 35 sensor, which has 1.5 crop compared to full frame. It doesn't do photos, yes, and it is pretty budget friendly and it is Netflix approved. So if you want to make your next Netflix movie, yes, you can do it on this camera. 3 important things I want to cover in this video. Since this is a cinema camera, what's most important is the look of the image. How good does it look? How cinematic it looks? What is the dynamic range? Okay, we know it's 16 stops, for example, compared to 13.8 on R5. But what does that really mean? How does that really look? Especially now that we know that this camera has the same sensor as C300 Mark II, which is twice the price, but it's not as good as a build quality. Also, this camera is known for not as good autofocus, but keep in mind, cinema cameras are usually used manually with teams of people, so you don't really need autofocus, but since it's here, we should talk about it. And the last thing we should cover is low light performance. So let's start with the dynamic range. This is a pretty interesting one. What I like about this here, that we have not just Canon Log 3 like in Canon R5, but also we have Canon Log 2. It's been pretty interesting that Canon did not include RAW in this camera, even though this is a cinema camera. But funny enough, today I found out on the news that it's coming out in a software update in March. So this camera will actually write RAW light 12-bit internally on the SD card. Keep in mind, the SD cards are pretty expensive. So we are actually going to be unlocking new features in this camera and probably will be getting a better dynamic range. But at this point of a time, I tested out C-Log 2 and C-Log 3 and I found out that C-Log 2 has a bit better dynamic range and overall better look. However, it's a little bit more flatter profiles, so it's harder to grade. But that's why I included those free LUTs in the description so you guys can use them and test them out. Here is the perfect scenario I decided to test. We have an inside of the car and we have always these blown out windows. I hate every time you shoot inside of the car, you always get a blown out window. So I wanted to test out how does this camera going to be capable opposed to Canon R5, which claims to have 13.8 stops compared to 16. So here is a flat profile of the C70 properly exposed in C-Log 2. This is underexposed by 2 stops. And this is overexposed by 2 stops. And let's show you the same thing with the Canon R5. However, here we are using C-Log 3. Again, properly exposed, underexposed by 2 stops, and overexposed by 2 stops. What I am trying to do here is to find out if we will be able to save the image even though it's underexposed or overexposed, and how good is the actual dynamic range when we properly expose the image. Interestingly enough, I did not find a big difference when we properly expose the image on both cameras. They both look very good, but in my testing when I was underexposing and overexposing, I found out some interesting things. C70 actually performs better when you overexpose it by 1 or 2 stops. I would actually recommend to overexpose it by 1 stop, even though on camera, on the screen, you would see the zebras going crazy and it will tell you it's overexposed, but it's actually not. And even by overexposing by 2 stops, the image is still very good. And if you pull down the sliders for the highlights and shadows, you are getting back all information, even though it's not raw. However, when you underexpose by 1 or 2 stops, it's starting to lose the image. The worst thing is the noise that is being introduced in the shadows. When you start pulling them, it gets very noisy. And the autofocus just doesn't work when it's underexposed. It's funny because the camera autofocus actually performs great if the image is exposed right. But as soon as it's a little bit too dark, the camera has a really hard time finding the proper autofocus. Where in Canon R5, when underexposing, I did not find as much noise and the autofocus was perfect. Since we are talking about autofocus, let's touch on that a little bit more. I've been using Canon R5 for over a year now, and I'm used and spoiled by great autofocus that just locks on right away. No matter if it's a face, subject, with tracking points, it works usually like 95, 97% of the time. With the C70, it was interesting. If you see a face and the exposure is properly done, the autofocus will work great. So is the subject detection. As long as we have perfect light condition, we're good. But as long as it's becoming a bit darker, it struggles. So I would compare it to the 6D Mark II. If you heavily rely on autofocus, I would say it works at about 75% time, maybe 80. It's not as bad, but it's just not as good as dual pixel autofocus. By the way, if you guys noticed the little globe over, oh, there it is, the lamp, I'm using a Moment Cinebloom filter. What do you guys think about a cinematic look? This filter was only about 50 to 70 bucks. I also linked it in the description. It's pretty cool what it does to the image, I think so. So I also went to the beach and I decided to shoot some night scenes to check out the low light performance. And I also found out some pretty interesting results. So I was using Sigma EF35 1.4 and Canon 85 1.4 lenses. These were used using the adapter. The adapter is 0.71, which means it pretty much converts the Super 35 look to full frame look, so you get more light into the camera, which means my 1.4 was multiplied by 0.71, which was f.99, which allowed more light into the camera and better performance in low light. Or not. Well, it depends. It was because we were allowing more light into the camera, like I said, and we were getting brighter image. But compared to Canon R5, it was a lot more noisier. I would say maybe 30% more noisier. And I would say the highest usable ISO was about 6400. Where it was at R5, I was going all the way up to 12,800 ISO and I was fine. Here with the C70, when I went up to 12,800, it was getting a lot noisier. But again, it was brighter because my f1.4 started to become f.99 or something. But pro tip, if you use Neat Video, it's about $100 subscription. You can throw it on top of it and it will clean out your image perfect. So to conclude, what I really liked about this camera and what I didn't like. I love the ND filters. I know I didn't even mention this yet, but the ND filters are such a clutch. Oh my God. Like, it was such a pleasure just with a click of a button, click, click, and you just switch the NDs right there, built in camera. I think that's one of the things that makes a cinema camera, where like Sony came out with FX3, and I mean, it is cinema camera, it's very tiny, but come on, it doesn't have ND filters. I don't know. I also like the form factor of this camera. It's bigger than mirrorless, but it's smaller than actual cinema camera. So it's somewhere in 1DX line, but it's more square box. And I like the grip, I like the handle, and the build quality is pretty good. I also like the quality of an image that this camera produces. As I mentioned before, it has the same sensor as C300 Mark II, and I like the C-Log 2 look of it. And now we're gonna have RAW, so we should have even better image. Now, what I didn't like, on the other hand, is the screen. I don't know, I am so used to Canon R5 flippy screen, which is great. It flips out, it's high quality, the touch works all the time. Here, the touch doesn't always work, and some things on the screen you can't even click on. So some things are touch and some are not. And the build quality of the screen is really poor. It's like so wiggly. It reminds me of like a JVC from 1995 where you open the thing up and it just like wobbles. I don't know. Not really sure why they did that. It also kind of sucks that this has a Super 35 sensor and it has an RF mount. So when you put any RF lens on it, it's gonna crop an image about 1.5. And the only way to get a full frame look, you have to use EF lenses, which kind of sucks because this is RF mount camera. So you should be utilizing RF lenses because they are better supposedly than EF lenses. But you are forced to use EF lenses, which are cheaper, which is an advantage, which gives you a full frame look. There is also no IBIS in this camera. And as far as I know, none of the cinema cameras from Canon have IBIS. And in a nutshell, these cameras are cinema cameras. So again, usually you have a team of people and you use the rigs, assistants to pull focus, to stabilize your camera and stuff like that. so IBIS is not really a thing in the camera, but we will see what happens in the future. I also was not a fan of the autofocus system on this camera, but again, this is also controversial, same point as I just mentioned before. And I also didn't like as much the noise, low light performance compared to the R5. Well, now, since you know more about this camera, who is this camera for? Is this camera for you? Well, it depends. Keep in mind, this camera doesn't do photos. So if you're coming from the photography world or you're trying to use a hybrid camera, of course you won't be able to use this camera for photos. This is video camera only because it's a cinema camera. So I would say this is a great camera for small budget commercial professional shoots, or maybe even for full-time filmmakers who do weddings. If you want to step up your game a bit and have more cinematic, more high quality budget film, this is the camera for you. If you're willing to put up with the autofocus with the size of this camera, but you're sacrificing this for a high quality image, go for it. If you're a run and gun videographer and sometimes you need to take photos here and there, I would not recommend to go for this camera unless you will have a backup body like R5 or R6 or whatever else you're using just for photos, and keep this camera just for videos. But again, keep in mind, this camera will take much more time to set up and to deal with if you're trying to use it as a run and gun camera, especially shooting, for example, sports or extreme situations. Like sometimes I would shoot a bike video commercial and you have to put the camera on gimbal and you have to hold it and you have to follow the subject, and run and gun situation, this might be a bit too clunky and heavy and not as convenient as something as the R5 or even Sony a7S III. So that is up for you to decide, and if you like this video, please hit the thumbs up button down there, and if you want some free LUTs, go ahead and download them here. And finally, the details of the giveaway. If you would like to participate in the giveaway, and my channel is small so your chances are very high, all you have to do is subscribe to my channel here, follow these two pages on Instagram, which are pretty much the brand of the rain jacket, and also comment below where would you take this rain jacket to. Now keep in mind, this giveaway is only for US only, so you have to live here in order to participate, and I will announce the winners in the week in my next video. That's it, as simple as that. Thank you again so much for watching. I really appreciate you. See you next time. Peace.